Perfect. Okay. Thanks for everyone's patience with the weird technicalities and everything, waiting for everyone to get in. But I'd like to welcome everyone to today's event, Debating Degrowth, where we're talking about whether degrowth can provide an alternative to extractivism and extractivist forms of organizing societies. I'd like to start by welcoming our speaker, Marta Conde, and our two invited discussants, Prototi Roy and Katarina Richter, and of course our co-organizer / third discussant, Alexander Dunlap. Just to introduce myself quickly, my name is Saana Hokkanen. I'm a PhD researcher at the Global Development Studies at the University of Helsinki and a member of the EXALT initiative, and I'll be facilitating today's event. To start on a practical note, I'd like to remind everyone that we're recording this event, so even if you need to pop out or miss something from this, we got you. And the recording will be published on the EXALT YouTube channel. And before we move on to today's topic, I'd like to just shortly reintroduce the EXALT dialogue series in general for those who weren't able to make it to the first dialogue in February. So this event is the second one of the dialogue series, and I'm really excited to have it on the topic of degrowth, because the aim of the EXALT dialogues was to create this kind of online space a few times a year to discuss, learn, and weave thoughts together on topical, urgent, transformational issues in critical research related to extractivisms, different forms of capitalist violences, and concurrent global crises. But to also focus on roadmaps and pathways out of these, and to emphasize actually transformative alternatives and ways of careful and more just ways of being with the world. And the hope for today's discussion is to explore how perspectives from both the extractivism and the degrowth literature and thinking, or how extractivisms confront the degrowth thinking, and what kind of thoughts and ideas arise from the crossroads of these two literatures. So the event today lasts for about an hour and 45 minutes, and we start with a short keynote from Marta Conde, which then is followed by questions and comments from our three discussants, and then finally a shared discussion and a Q&A at the end. So participants are super welcome to ask questions and comments, but we'd like to ask you to do that.
Days ago.
Sorry? Did I hear someone?
Yeah, I think you just need to mute stuff. Please keep your screens muted during presentations.
My screen is muted?
No, not you.
Okay, great. But yeah, so anyways, participants, comments, questions, please, all of that is welcome, but do put them in the chat, because there's a lot of people here and we'll pick them out throughout from the chat. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce our speakers properly. Our main speaker, like I said, is Marta Conde, who's a Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Queensland and Autonomous University of Barcelona. She's also a member of the Research and Degrowth Network and has published brilliant work on extractivism and governance of extractive industries, which she then also links to degrowth and environmental justice. Prototi Roy, our first discussant, is a postdoctoral researcher jointly based at Central European University in Vienna and the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. She's an ecological economist and a political ecologist, a member of the Research Degrowth Network, and a co-founder of the Degrowth Initiative. Katarina Richter is a lecturer in climate change, politics, and society at the University of Bristol. She's also a co-organizer at a webinar series called Degrowth Talks, and does research in environmental social science from a decolonial perspective. And finally, working in the double role of being both the co-organizer for this event and our third discussant, Alexander Dunlap, is a visiting research fellow at the Global Development Studies at the University of Helsinki. So we have an amazing setup of speakers today, and I'll now give the floor and stage to Marta, and I'll stop talking.
Thank you. I'm going to try and share my screen, my presentation with you. That working?
Yeah, that's working.
Excellent. So I want to first acknowledge, since everybody does it here in Australia, and I think it's very important, that I'm speaking from the land of the Yugambeh people. These are the traditional owners of the land where I live now, who I am quite convinced lived using much less and more local resources than we do now. So I wanted to start by explaining my interest in extractivism and the idea of degrowth. I have been interested in mining conflict since I landed in the mining conflict of Yanacocha gold mine in Cajamarca, Peru, back in 2007. Until then, I actually had no idea what mining was. Even having had quite a city shelter life, even though I was interested in environmental issues, I actually did not think where everything around me came from. Now I see mining everywhere. I don't know if it happens to you. I see everything is mining, but that really opened my eyes. So then I was back in Spain, very lost. And I met with John Martinez Allier in one talk. I had never met with him before. I didn't even know who he was. And he really encouraged me to do a master and a PhD at EXALT, which I did. And there I met other researchers. We were exploring degrowth and were inspired by Francois Schneider's first conference of degrowth in Paris. So we decided to organize one in Barcelona. So this was the start of research on degrowth. This organization based in Barcelona, that Rototi, who's also a speaker today, is also a member. So through ecological economics, political ecology, and degrowth, it soon became very clear to me that mining and all its impacts were the consequences of expanding social metabolism, especially of Western societies. And in order to challenge that, we needed to lower our energy and material consumption. And this was a central tenet, and still is obviously, of degrowth. But degrowth proposes that this downscale of energy and material consumption needs to be equal and fair. And for this, we need to reverse continuous effects of colonization, racism, the impact on indigenous and peasant and other marginalized groups, and undo the unfair position women has had in society for centuries. Mainly putting, for example, life and care at the center of decision-making and welfare distribution. But what I really like about degrowth is that actually it posits, it says that we can actually be more happy. For some reason, for many people, okay, it's going to be very difficult to be happy with less material consumption. We're growing used to all these materials, but the promises are quite good. Because we're going to be work sharing, going to be working less hours. We're going to have more time for family and friends, for hobbies, for food growing, and crucially for democratic decision-making and participation in direct democracy that will indeed require a lot of time, something we're not used to, no? Read, understand what's going on, take decisions about things that matter to us. So this will have been, until now, very short, but would have been more or less the explanation that I will have given between degrowth and extractivism. But for a while now, I've been wanting to go deeper into this link. So I really thank Anna and Alexander's invitation that's given me the chance to finally say, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to look more into it. So I'm going to apologize a bit because now it's going to get a bit more dense. So that's why at the end I did the presentation, because I'm hoping you can follow me better. And also the ideas are obviously evolving. So I'd love to have your feedback. So what I have done is that I've explored the evolution of the concept of extractivism that has evolved completely enormously in the last years. And so I'm going to introduce you a bit of the story of extractivism and my take on the main tenets, the most important things of extractivism, because they're not going to only help us understand how degrowth could provide an alternative to extractivism, but I think it's also going to point which aspects of degrowth we need to focus more in order to overcome extractivism. Because degrowth is very wide. So which of the tenets are important to overcome extractivism? But this will be at the end. So now I'm just going to do a short introduction of the history. Extractivism goes back to the start of capitalism. It emerged in the 16th century through colonial expansion of the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Places were plundered, turned into production, extraction, and export of raw materials. Local populations were turned into cheap labor or slavery. And even when land became barren, or if local populations revolted or demanded higher salaries, capital will then move elsewhere. This is how the dynamic of commodity frontiers. And this set the symmetrical power structures and exploitation that carry on today. Child labor, land distribution. So then industrialization, you had capitalists investing in machines, make it easier to extract more and generating even more demand for resources. And during the 18th century, this joined with the idea of liberal development. The idea that you can have perpetual improvement, modernity. So all this was operated through extractivism. Then in the next century, this idea continued, but it was pushed through market liberalism and free trade, sparking neo-colonization in regions like Latin America, internal colonization. So towards the end of the 20th century, through neoliberalism, again, a new wave of capital investment driven by massive deregulation, expanded through countries like Chile and Indonesia, and then followed by the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So they all followed, again, this modernist logic of resource-fueled development. And as we know, this has further exacerbated inequalities and ecological impacts. Also during the 2000s, countries like Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela, starting a phase that has now been termed neo-extractivism. These countries look to obtain more revenues through the nationalization and taxation of mining and extraction, but use their revenues to fight poverty and enhance the material well-being of their populations. So, however, the problem is that they actually apply the same resource cost-based development model. So this again has created new enclosures, ecological destruction, and the loss of democracy, local democratic processes. So Ye and his colleagues have written this very interesting article analyzing the link between capitalism and extractivism, and highlight that whilst before extractivism was isolated in certain areas, it is now part of global capitalism. So you have through mergers and acquisitions, you have big corporations that together with the state and now have such concentration of power in few hands that they control whole food and other raw materials networks. And so now we can no longer talk about extractivism, but we need to talk about extractivisms with S at the end, no? Because it's not limited, extractivism is not limited to a country or a region. It's now part of an ideology, a mindset driven by capitalist development. And that it's absorbed into every practice. So you find extractivism in different localities and contexts. You have different forms of extraction, and you extract different types of materials and even immaterial stuff. We can talk about extractivism through the classic mining of fossil fuel extraction, as well as agribusiness, forestry, aquaculture, and more recently, green extractivism. The large-scale energy projects and the massive expansion of mining required for the energy transition. This Alexander talks a lot about. But the thing is now the term is also being used for many other areas such as data extractivism or digital extractivism. And there's some people that actually disagree with this, not that they like to keep it to more material stuff, but I actually do see this logic everywhere. I even see it in my own research, for example. I've sometimes experienced that my own research has been extractive. You know, I was even saying this to a colleague the other day, especially in sociology, social-based research, where you do interviews. Sometimes you feel, what am I giving back? So I feel like I should not study groups, but actually work with them to help them attain their objectives and make that the objective of my research. So I see this logic of taking away without giving back, without reciprocity. I see it in many places. It's deeply varied in many aspects of life around us. In worth ethics, in consumer lifestyles, we take, but we don't give back. We are too far away to even consider how do we give back. How do we give back, for example, when we go to a supermarket? No, how are we going to do that? So So I want to now turn into what I think for me were at the base, the main tenets of extractivism. What does the act of resource, when does the act of resource extraction turn into capitalist-driven ideology or a mindset of capitalism? What makes extraction turn to extractivism? So I've come up with 5 tenets. And the first one is that it's not about the social, so extraction is not about the social use or the extraction of resources, but extractivism. So extractivism is not about the social use and extraction of resources, but about the fact that it's geared towards capitalist world market, whose benefits are concentrated and appropriated by a few. And the decision to extract is driven by a specific idea of capitalistic growth and development. Even Bolivia, for example, has growth, wants growth at all costs. So the second point is that this entails an unfair distribution of cost and benefits. Those at local levels suffer all the impacts, and also along the commodity change, whilst they get very few benefits. And even when they get some benefits, they're badly distributed, so they generate internal local conflicts. This we find in every mining conflict. So we also find this unfair distribution is historical. As we have seen, it started with colonialism and carries on today. And there's also an unfair distribution of power. It marginalizes decision-making of a myriad of people, peasant and indigenous groups, local cultures, cosmovisions, different relations to land, and also ignores the gender impacts imposed by patriarchal domination. Because this unfair distribution of costs and benefits is based on the idea of non-reciprocity. Take, but not give back. Again, what we were saying before, no, when I was talking about research. So my third point is that extractivism is not about the extractions of materials per se, but about who decides what we do with them, how do we live, whose vision of prosperity is imposed. My fourth point is also that extractivism is carried out through violent reorganization of territories. This is very clear at the start of colonialism, but even now we see, we see expansion of commodity frontiers, violence, but also where we see subvert forms of violence, like slow violence. We see pollution that grows over time and in the bodies of people and in the lands and affects their health in very slow way growing. So, and finally, technology. I think Alexander also talks about this, but I find technology has 2 important roles in supporting extractivism. One is by increasing extractivism. So through improved techniques and machinery, it's a constant ally of capital and commodity frontiers. Areas that were devastated in the past are now being opened again for commodity extraction with new technology. Another aspect also of technology is that it justifies extractivism. So through technology, we can justify ideas like sustainable mining, sustainable agribusiness, which is an oxymoron in itself. So, we need to challenge the ideology of extractivism. And to do that, we need to challenge the ideology of capitalism, because capital accumulation is based on extractivism. So here I think Degrowth offers a pathway out of capitalism. There are other pathways, the socialism, communism, not state-led communism, actually community-led. Pathways from the South, like Sumat Kausai, radical ecological democracy, ecofeminism. We consider, in Degrowth, we consider them like sister movements, similar ideas with differences, some of them contextual, place-based. But I like to why I came into Degrowth is because I landed at ICTA. Maybe I would have landed somewhere else and they were talking more about socialism and I would have really liked it more, But at the end, we want more or less the same thing. So we should focus on the things that unite us rather than things that, take us apart. Which is what the left does a lot, doesn't it? Just, I don't agree with you, little thing. Anyway, and so how do we challenge extractivism through Degrowth? Where do we focus? So I've picked three areas that respond to the tenets I identified before. One is we need to diminish demand of energy materials to diminish the pressure to extract. We need to change the dogma of growth, the idea that growth is good, that consumption is good. This is what we have been fed for the last decades. We continue to be fed through advertising. So this is what Latouche has termed the decolonization of the imaginary. So instead of focus on consumption, we should be focusing on what is called relational goods, social relations, sharing, care, conviviality. These give us more happiness than consumption. Consumption is just 15 minutes after you buy something. So in Degrowth, we acknowledge that if you diminish consumption, this will affect jobs. So we need to gear the economy towards less energy and material intensive jobs. There's a lot written on that, but I won't go into that. That's another part. So in order to diminish demand, Yorgos Kallis advocates for personal limits. I think we're actually a lot more geared than we think to have personal limits. I don't know if, I think even before I knew everything about mining, I had personal limits. We put personal limits in our everyday lives many times. So now it's about making a bit more conscious effort with them. With my kids, I put limits on what we eat, what we do. But it's not only about personal limits. We also need regulatory frameworks. We need to have more research and resource caps, limit resource consumption. And the EU, for example, is moving towards measuring and having targets on material footprints as part of the EU Circular Economy Action Plan. So all these are moves in the right direction, but we need to actually put pressure and support these processes so they're a bit more radical. I haven't followed it lately, but there you are. So we need to put pressure on them. We also need to control technology. Because as Elul points out, it seems like technology, it just drives itself. It's not controlled by us. And we see this, for example, with artificial intelligence. It's just getting scary at the moment. And we need to be careful with solutions like energy efficiency, circular economy, even recycling, because they're all paths in the right direction, but won't reduce energy and material consumption enough. They're just partial solutions, and let alone the wishful thinking attached to green growth and the idea that we can decouple our material consumption from growth. That just won't be enough. It will take forever to do that, if we even able to do it, which I doubt it, but anyway. So to tackle urgent climate change, let alone extractivism, we just need to consume less, absolute reduction of energy and material consumption. My second point is that we need to support and learn from local indigenous groups and bottom-up forms of governance. So we need to support groups that are suffering the impacts of extractivism. We need to give the right to say no to these groups if they don't want a project. Not free prior thing from consent, which it's been co-opted, it's not working as such. I now advocate for the right to say no, because it's not as ambiguous. And we need to support local autonomous decision-making. This might lead to resource sovereignty. Some people might want to have mining in their lands. So this is actually what one of the main indigenous federations in Bolivia called CONAMAC proposed. They proposed community mining, where minerals will be owned jointly by the state and the community organizations. They will determine how much will be mined and how, as well as the distribution of benefits and impacts, and they will be involved in the mining itself. Unfortunately, it wasn't approved in the Constitution, but I think it's an excellent idea that could be, extracted and taken to other places. For example, this would be a very good idea in other contexts where you have increasing conflicts between artisanal mining and corporate-driven mining. So this could be an excellent model for these countries too. So the idea of sovereignty it could be expanded to other sectors like energy and food. And this could be also based in the collective ownership of land and its resources, supporting a very, very developed idea in Degrowth, which is the commons. So, and then another important aspect is that we need to learn from indigenous groups. They have an amazing attachment to land that drives them to protect it. So we need to somehow relearn that attachment. We need to find different paths. We cannot just, cover them, I think. I heard last week a delegation of the Naju people, a native group in southwestern Australia. They have this native land. And it was amazing to listen. They have such a connection to land. Anyway, but I don't have time to, if you want, I can explain to you later. And then my third point is that we need to support the redistribution of power and decolonization, reverse centuries of subordination of certain lands at the service of others. This has to happen at global level as well as nationally within each country and region. So how do we redistribute? Nationally, through policies such as cap or minimum salaries or basic or care income, and at international level with debt jubilees, stopping development banks and development projects that trying to influence decision-making, and again, support autonomous decision-making. That is not to say that, populations will decide, or countries will decide they want degrowth paths. Look at what happened in Chile yesterday, where a right-wing group hijacked now the writing of the new constitution. It's devastating. So hence the importance of decolonizing the growth imaginary, not only in the North, but also in the South. Because then otherwise, it just go into neo-colonization processes that you carry on and carry on. But finally, I think if we really need to challenge capitalism at its core, is crucially and very difficult, then we need to decommodify land, nature, and labor. These are important and basic aspects of life. And when they're treated as a commodity by the capitalist market, they're given a value, and it's moved around and doesn't serve the interest of the person that actually uses it. We lose control of it. So we need to regain that control. And I think, I wrote this with Diego Andreucci, that we think that a key point for joining forces, this is a key point for joining forces of resistance, the need to gain control of our jobs and our land. For example, we have workers in big supermarkets, chains, paid very little. These should join forces with farmers who also get very little for their produce. Another example is workers retrenched from a closed car factory due to the green transition. They should join forces with those affected by lithium mining. So workers all over the world are either oppressed by labor extraction or nature extraction or both. So they should join forces as they are all part of the same struggle. The struggle against extractivism, and it's the struggle against capitalism. Well, extractivism is part of the struggle against capitalism. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marta. That was a really... I would like to ask everyone else to mute their mics, if that's possible. But yeah, that was a tight half an hour, 25 minutes talk with a lot of stuff there, and I won't take too much space here, and I'll give the floor to Protapi.
Thank you so much, Marta. That was super good, and I thought of so many things while you were describing all the, first the history and then the way forward. And the one thing which kept coming to my mind was that this is simply not true. And I will give you an example of the logic of capitalism, or the logic which capitalists use to say why we need more growth, who are the ones for whom we need for whom we need more growth, and all the false narrative that they built around it, that that this is there's this term that is coming up now called post-truth, and you see it a lot. For example, I'm sorry, I'm a bit sick, so my voice is going to be like this. So for example, a couple of years ago, there was this idea of private auctioning of coal mines in India, despite India saying in the international forums that we are all going for green growth and going to focus more on solar and wind. There was this idea that, no, we still need to have more coal mines because it's going to give more jobs, and India is still so very energy poor, does not have electricity for all the population, so we need this. And then there is this process called the Right to Information Act, through which anybody can challenge, like from any government official, where is this information coming? And some environmental journalists wrote back to the government and said, can you please give us the document, or can you please give us the source from where you have the number of employment and from where you're calculating that this is going to be super good for the development of the country. And they came back saying, no, we don't have any reports or estimates. This is just what we think. So all this idea of this need that we still need more extractivism for the development of the country or for the prosperity of the people, the moment you start questioning them, or the moment you start asking for data, is just simply not true. And this is the part about this false narrative for the need of more and more economic growth, which I think we need to really question a lot and come up with numbers to say this is not true. To give another example, also linking a little bit Australia and India, there is this massive coal mine in Carmichael which is going to destroy the Great Barrier Reef, and it was given to this Indian multinational company called Adani. And the idea, the economic model for it was, the coal is going to come from Australia to a power plant in a state in India which has the largest reserve of coal in the country, in Jharkhand. And then the electricity which is going to be produced is going to go to Bangladesh, while Jharkhand still is one of the states which has very high energy poverty. So it really doesn't make sense. And these things keep happening again and again. And I think one way to also then question it is to kind of build alliances between all the communities and all the movements which are fighting against extractivism in different regions. For example, people who are fighting against extractivism in Indonesia, and where is the material which is being mined there going to, and what is happening. So looking at it through the entire supply chain to share more information, and to basically question the lies and the nonsense about this idea of what is a good life, or the idea of why we still need more extractivism for a better life. And the other thing here, which is also I wanted to touch upon, which you mentioned, was this idea of internal colonialism, or this idea of the imperial mode of living. And here the global geopolitics becomes very important, because I see this again in the Indian context of people saying, no, but India still needs to grow. We still need more and more material and energy resources. But then you start looking at the numbers again, and then you see all this material energy is going to go to the big capital cities, and nothing is going to go to the places where the extraction actually happens, where people who are often marginalized, or people who are the indigenous communities, live there. So even if you look at the grand narrative, which is anyways false, even that starts to crumble down. And then, so I just wanted to add this, and then everything else that you said follow. Yeah, thank you.
Do you want to reply quickly, Marta, to any of this? No?
No.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I think it's great because she's given actual case to mine was very abstract. So now we actually can feel it. Yeah, it's great.
Thank you, Pratati, so much. And now I'd like to, does Xander or Katarina want to go first? I'm going to let you decide.
Do you want to go, Xander? My internet is being a bit funny at the moment, so yeah, do you want to go? And then hopefully when you're done, my connection is a little bit more stable. Okay, thanks.
Let's do that. All right, thanks everyone for being here. Thank you so much, Marta, for the lovely presentation, all the discussants. I'm so happy everyone's here. I'm so happy there's such a great turnout for this. Let's get into it. So I've been teaching a class on extractivism and degrowth here. It's been really good. So this is giving me an opportunity to go into the literature. So these nerdy dead-end words that we work with here in academia, but maybe it could be kind of fun to get into it. But one thing that I've noticed, so first of all, Marta and Mariana, I think we're the first to actually really write a nice piece, kind of bringing this together in the degrowth, the vocabulary for the new dictionary. So this was very nice. I think there's some good things in there. And one of the most important things I see in this short 3-page kind of entry that's covering a lot of ground is the way that they're bringing ultimately Marxists and degrowthers together, and also kind of anti-extractivist struggles there in terms of talking about commodity frontiers and showing a common cause and struggle, which I think is so accurate, which really is not happening in academia with this kind of weird academic shit show and people really trying to take things the wrong way and get into these things. And something Marta also commented on. But but I see very similar issues between degrowth and extractivism. Mostly that they're both based on kind of looking at this kind of large scale, kind of national developed economics kind of background and platform. You know, from extractivism, this kind of comes from dependency theory and world systems theory to a degree. And in degrowth, this comes from ecological economics. But again, these two actually overlap quite significantly. One could even go so far as to say that some of the best kind of accounting with material footprint is actually emerging of at least a reaction to extractivism to account it, and how kind of degrowthers have taken this up. And I think one of the recent articles by Jason Hickel looking at what was it called? The imperial appropriation in the world economy by Hickel et al. That came out really showing the way the material and energy is flowing from the south to the north and in other directions as well. But so I think there's actually so much commonality and ultimately similar problems between them, especially when we look at extractivism and the extractivism debates, where there's this kind of classical narrow definition about kind of national economies, you know, the classical, you know, export of raw materials, and really trying to look in a closed way at extractivism. And I think the same thing happens with degrowth when, you know, really there's a lot of top-down proposals, it's very economic language and so on and so forth. But I just like to say 3 points that kind of come up that I think are both kind of reoccurring issues between both of them that I want to press on. There's actually many, but to focus on 3. I think the biggest problem with degrowth and a lesser degree to extractivist research, and I think Marta said it very well, the struggle against extractivism is the struggle against capitalism, is that there's actually a lacking definition of what is actually anti-capitalist. And this relates to also kind of the issue of, you know, what is colonialism, what is neocolonialism, and how does that relate to the state? But let's focus on this other one, because I see a kind of a bit of a trapdoor for degrowth come up here, how they're very speaking vaguely about anti-capitalism and how this can really pass out for a lot of things. Now, some people still think that the Soviet command economy and state capitalism in itself was anti-capitalist, which I think is a really big problem. I see this getting sorted out a bit. We saw for an eco-socialist degrowth that they actually made a statement against this, which I think was a really big win and progress, in addition to the fact that, you know, degrowthers and eco-Marxists and other types of Marxists, other people in the Marxology field have been actually arguing about the difference between capital accumulation and fighting growth, when I see them as being very much the same. I read a piece from Marta who also related this to commodity frontiers, and I think that's such a silly division. And then on the other hand, you have Marxists really pressing for this kind of socialist accumulation, which I think is a really big problem, and really trying to avoid the realities of modernism and industrialization, and also the harebrained kind of technological development we're subject to. If you're in a university, I've already been whining about digitalization and all of that this morning. The second is kind of the economic modeling that goes on between both this. This goes with the national perspectives and how they're trying to look at these things in more classical definitions of extractivism, but also in ecological economics. I think obviously there can be a use for these things, you know, to fight, especially in practical ways, to submit to a colonial system, to try to fight within its institutions and levers. Sure, there can be a way to kind of do this with material footprint and things like this. But more importantly, I think there's a serious problem that from researcher to people that are identifying themselves as quote activists, is this kind of disembodied perspective where everyone's trying to be this weird planner and social engineer of society, when we really actually have to live within our habitats and actually struggle there and build those connections. Otherwise, there's no point to struggle. We're never going to really care enough. We're going to identify more with the junk food television and weird programs that are actually just cheap kind of fixes and new addictions that are rather intentionally modeled by not only kind of fast food companies in terms of how chips will crunch in your mouth and what types of salts and things they use, but also in the way that, you know, the different kind of endorphins that are released by using our cell phones and things like this. But I see a really big problem with ecological economics and these kind of distance kind of perspectives, either at the national or even global in terms of how we're modeling and talking about things. That's not to, again, not to say that they're can't be used, but I think we really need to get away. I mean, the fact that I still see people using the term in ecological economics, ecosystem services is really concerning in this way that mechanical philosophy is still embedded and exists. But okay, moving along, yeah, but most importantly, the biggest issue, and why I'm even saying the second point about this modeling, it's making weak assessments. Carbon is not a good enough metric to understanding how destructive this system is and what it's actually doing to people, animals, rivers, waters, and trees. So we're not actually getting accurate assessments for exactly how messed up this system is with these models, with this data, the way we're doing research, the way that we're in universities. There needs to be a real reshift in how we're actually living and working, and this means transforming our institutions in a very serious way that is going to be really social and ecologically sustainable. And a lot of what we call climate crisis, as we all know, and what Peter Gelderloos has been saying really good the last couple of years, is really social crises and how things are being planned. And this relates to third, extractivism, especially again, I'm going after the more classical definitions, and also degrowth. You know, people are still using the term renewable energy. There's still this kind of and it's great. And Martha, thanks so much for mentioning green extractivism. You're coming in there, powering through this, and I've been doing work on this as well, looking at this stuff. But man, this stuff is not renewable. These large-scale infrastructures that are grabbing land, that are expanding. I mean, I can go on this for hours. But the way that this national kind of economic framework or European Green Deals or how degrowthers have been until recently, and again, degrowth in a lot of these literatures are huge ecosystems. So it's only some people who are starting to acknowledge the really serious issue of not only the direct extraction of kinetic energy from low carbon infrastructures, wind, solar, hydrological, you name it, but also the supply chains that are so extensive and so messed up. So I see these areas as being very weak. And then finally, you know, there's already such a war in the streets. There are so many combative fighters and people who are struggling, being marginalized, killed, being bought out by social development funds who are against these things. So there are so many people fighting and struggling for this. And I'd really like to see academia, and especially degrowth, who I've already commented in the past, has not adequately acknowledged the land struggles, not only in Latin America, but the ones in their own backyard, and really the extent of fighting in the Humbach forest, the extent of fighting even in the Muy Alta Tensión Mina. So the high tension power line struggles outside Barcelona, the no tab movement, you know, all the different zona de fonds or ZADs in France that are going on, and the attacks that they're experiencing right now are very real. And I think academia, and especially degrowth, that positions itself, quote, as activist, which I don't think is a productive or useful term, can do much better in actually looking at these struggles and what they're doing. But okay, I finished there. Marta, thank you so much. I appreciate this and all the other comments. I don't want to take up more time.
Thank you, Xander. Is there anything, Marta, you'd like to reply to quickly here or move on to? Yeah. Okay. Katarina, are you there potentially?
A few times, so I'm just going to keep my video.
Okay, we're not having the best internet connection for you.
Apologies for that. Do let me know if you can't hear me or if you. Okay. We're happy to have heard all of it, at least. Can you hear me now?
It's a bit
okay.
patchy.
Let me know if you can hear me. I think you're...
Katarina, it's a bit patchy.
Okay. Do you want to move on and I'll come in a bit?
Maybe we'll do that. Yeah, if that works for everyone, because I think that we've all had our fair share of listening to patchy Zoom calls, and let's hope that you'll get yours more functional maybe. But yeah, I think we'll give a little time to Marta here to address what was said by Protopi and Xander.
Okay.
And then we'll,
Yeah, okay, thank you. I agree with Xander's comments. Yeah, I mean, I agree that degrowth initially at the start was a bit weak with showing it was anti-capitalist. It's probably not even developed enough at the start. But I think now it's quite clear, at least for me or all of us, in research and degrowth, that we want to, we do believe it's anti-capitalism. What anti-capitalism actually is, it's is what we make of it. We us together, we're thinking how we exit capitalism. We're pointing to ways that we think we, going to help us exit. Where we get to is the dream that we're putting forward. No, it's like all this, shared time, more conviviality, and the growth, I think, is actually very good at putting it very rosy where we're going. So even too rosy. It really be hard for many people. So I think we're doing a good way of doing this, putting the imaginary there. There's a lot of there's many nice exercises done in, for example, in the degrowth masters that we carry out on narratives and the building of narratives on how we're going to get there and where we get there. But this is what they are, narratives at the moment. And another thing you were saying, it was, sorry, I don't know, I have so many notes that, about academia and there's not enough attention to local struggles. I do agree there's not enough attention to local struggles, but at the same time, I mean, I don't know, people that have been working in extractivism or mining conflicts, theoretically speaking, it's hard to come up with something theoretically, contribute theoretically to something when it's another mining conflict, because mining conflicts have the same dynamics all the time. And we've been discussing this with Diego, that I work a lot with him. And I find it, that's why I also moved into other areas, because I can write about numerous conflicts, but they all respond to the same dynamic and the same actors. And it's sure that it's been evolving, and you should have done a very good job on showing, where it's been expanding, this extractivism. But I actually think that we should become, if we're going to be researchers, we can become activists in those struggles. I know you don't like the term, but at least you contribute to the struggle. And so I think, it's a matter of engaging. It's what you said at the beginning, we need to engage with the change rather than, that's sometimes the problem I see with academia, that writes, describes, and that's what you were saying about the ecological economics, that they like to analyze, to model, but they don't actually engage with the change. So I do agree with that we should engage more with the change actually happening. But at the same time, I do think, whilst I agree with you that ecosystem services, we shouldn't be even contemplating them, but social metabolism analysis, I actually find it quite useful to develop a narrative, because I use it in my own presentations the evolution of mining extraction has been growing exponentially in the last 50 years. It's like, and it's so useful to have, Marina Skowalski, Groundsman, all these people doing this analysis actually in Vienna, and it's useful. But yeah, I mean, how could they engage locally in that struggle? It's difficult for them. But yeah, I'll leave it there. There's many questions.
Thank you, Marta. Yeah, and I think Kat's network is working better now, so we'll give her the spot here to give her comments and questions.
Thank you, and for your patience. Feel free to let me know or just mute if it gets too patchy. I won't be offended. So I'll try to say my piece quick while the connection lasts. So much you really enjoy and put every context, very clear between capitalism and extractivism. And I guess the first point I want to make is around the connection between capitalism and growth, which is the sort of, capitalism being dependent on economic growth, and that beyond sort of GDP growth being this kind of objective, it's also, the ideology, and, we frame economic growth and capitalism, it's limitless. We need to solve all sorts of problems, whether that's innovation or healthcare, and that naturalizes this accumulation via extractivism, right, and obscures the kind of biophysical processes, and not just the ecocidal and the genocidal kind of tendencies that we see in extractivism. And I guess here degrowth is really like and kind of talk about this culture as a sort of hegemonic ideology, and the sense, so shared to and if you consent growth and capitalism is this sort of very kind of dominant way in which we sort of cement, or paradigm within, whether that's within sort of popular culture or climate policy making, for example, when we think about these growth-based shared socio-paths that are the PCC's assessment reports. Those common sense sort of at the institutional and policy, but also in kind of everyday practice. And I think that's, movements at the moment are really trying to change these common senses, where we, Gortoti and Zander both talked about this, and whether that's in the UK with Just Stop Oil or Extinction Rebellion or Fridays for Future, where we see a lot of young people, mainly young people, but also others really trying to push to kind of question this and this logic, whether that goes far enough or whether, they're questioning the sort of consumption-based, this imperial mode of living in their own life to an extent is another debate. But I think this struggle is really the sort of big, between these two common senses, is that big struggle of our decade, I think. And I think the other thing I'd like to pick up on was, Marta, is it's really interesting that you mentioned kind of and you and I think work very, very briefly by what I'm working in Ecuador, looking in here in practice. You've already mentioned this, the sort of Andean Amazonian conceptualization of good living that comes from the indigenous world. And I sort of connected Buen Vivir, or the struggle for alternatives to growth-based development, and degrowth as a sort of, two systemic alternatives, one from Latin America and one from North. And so from there, I observed various kind of rituals that actually sort of cosmological personal limits are quite individualistic, and they're sort of morally constructed, and that can be quite depoliticized. So I think they're a nice alternative to the also depoliticized sort of planetary boundaries that say, okay, there's these hard physical limits and there is no sort of political negotiation, and even though they might be climate change as a planetary boundary itself is, you know, depends very much from where you're based, for example. So the sort of 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, you know, it's very different if you live in sub-Saharan Africa than if you actually live in Northern Europe, for example. And then others say that, you know, we should have sort of societal limits, so sort of define threshold to sort of limit, to contain ecological. But I think saying and to sort of take the sort of struggles of, and that's the case in Ecuador, for example, we can, you know, learn quite a lot from them for degrowth as well. And I recognize that sort of anthropocentrism in degrowth that Xander was talking about in the economic modeling and the use of sort of, you know, ecosystem services and materials has their, as again, sort of disconnect nature and culture. Logical limits to actually arise out of our view. And so in the view where connection to nature was based on reciprocity and dependent on it, and sort of Mother Nature was not a symbol but a living being that you had to take care of. And so those cosmological limits to growth are actually able to contain socially harmful and ecologically destructive sort of activities. But that with degrowth, we have this big challenge to say, well, you know, it's not enough to implement policies that, you know, resource caps or universal basic income, those won't be successful if we continue to, you know, live within this culture of growth, if we continue to see nature as a resource. So in addition to the socio-economic reforms, we also need, you know, rapid cultural change. And that's the big question of how we can move away from this anthropocentrism, sort of move away from seeing the resource something that a sort of ecological economics answer, open up debate about, you know, what are the cultures of this particular socio-ecological transformation. I might stop here just because I know there's loads and loads of questions. So yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Kat. I think this is, again, one of the blessings and curses that we're connecting through technology, that it's amazing that we can connect through distance, but then there's always the technological stuff that might not work perfectly. But thank you so much. I think we got some parts, some main parts from that. And I think, Xander, if you wanted to reply to what Marta was saying earlier, and then I'll give the floor again to Marta.
Yeah, thank you really quick. No, thanks so much, Marta, for replying, but just really quick. I mean, I agree, again, like I said, kind of from like working in a colonial institution and having to engage policy. You know, I'm also a fan of social metabolism, and that this is useful to kind of show these things. And there's been, I don't think it's enough in any way, shape, or form, but there has been improvement in terms of these accounting, you know, from GDP to social metabolism and kind of material footprint. But so I just want to make that clear. But yeah, and another thing that I just want to stress, and I agree with you of how almost standard you have very diverse cultural contexts and places being hit with the exact same structure of mining companies and governments that are facilitating these operations, or a part of them, or are them, depending on how the private public thing is negotiated. And this relates to kind of the first part of what you said about the type of research. But this is exactly why the research I've done has focused on using the lens of counterinsurgency, being in a very, I mean, all the security services are huge budget funded, you know, and so what type of research can I do that can be useful? If I can identify the different mechanisms and tools that are going on here, if I can identify the institutions, the doctrines, even if they don't operate exactly like that on the ground as different institutions want them to do, if you can identify these mechanisms, you can actually, I mean, at least that was my hope with what I've done. I don't actually feel that good about it being in academic journals, and it hasn't spread the way I wanted it to, or at least for people to be conscious of this, you know, especially mainstream environmental movements, especially environmental justice organizations, as it's called, who I don't think recognize or even use this framework of warfare ultimately, and understanding how territories and resources and people are grabbed, captured, and captivated, I think, more than anything. But I guess in conversation, I feel you completely, but that's one angle that I tried to go in on this, is to kind of use that lens to try to offer tools for people. And yeah, just stop oil. It's really, Kathleen, it's really sad the way they're actually making this distinction between peaceful and so-called non-peaceful protesters, and the way they're making these divisions when it seems like everyone's fate, no matter what tactics they use, are ending up in repression and jail. And it's, I don't think dividing movements this way and ignoring previous committed land defenders, especially Earth First, which is kind of an above ground organization, but ultimately a lot of the eco-anarchists, especially in the UK, what they've done is, I know this is just a commentary and just kind of sad at these new movements and how they have completely ignored, and at least are slowly starting to listen to people who have been in struggle longer. But again, that's it on my end. But thank you, everyone, and hopefully that clarifies things.
Thank you. And I think that I'm going to completely make use of my own position here as a facilitator and kind of jump on what Kat was talking about, to add just my own question to all of you, and my own problems that I've had maybe with degrowth in the past as a I don't know, a way of thought. And I'd like to kind of like throw this question out to all of you before I let Marta continue with that. So my question is that because degrowth kind of centers, or at least arises from this idea of countering something or critiquing growth and growthism, it's in a way this kind of a concept that focuses on a process, or mainly on transformation, and to degrow, to stop something, to stop growthism, rather than being this kind of what you all have also mentioned, these ways of good living, epistemological, ontological alternatives, or cosmovision, or practice of living, like lived alternatives like Buen Vivir or Ubuntu, for example. So my question therefore is, well, first of all, do you agree with this, that this is kind of like concept of transformation? Marta was saying that you see degrowth as a pathway out of capitalism, but then like what is at the end of the path? Where we arrive to? So do you agree with this? And because it arises mainly in opposition rather than for something specific, how can we make sure that like many other concepts of goodwill, how can we make sure that it doesn't become this amoeba empty concept that could, for example, be used to promote eco-modernist visions or stuff like that? And so in a way, what does degrowth have to offer after growthism? Because it can't just be good life will ensue. What good life for who and who gets to decide, and on which also epistemological basis and on what material basis. So that's kind of my question to all of you, and it's not a critique of degrowth per se, but just kind of like a point towards the limitations that I've seen that I think related to some of the things that you already talked about. But yeah, I'll let Marta start. Yeah.
Roto, do you want to say something? You haven't said anything for a while.
I can take this question if you want, Marta.
Yeah, I think you'll do well.
Okay. So degrowth, there's this very famous picture, of like this transformation of an elephant into a snail. So what degrowth talks about is not less of the same, but something different. And the reason why the term degrowth was used in the beginning, when this was becoming, well, it came from the French word décroissant, in starting with these car-free city movements in Lyon, and then so there's this whole history of how this term came into being, how it was popularized more in Western Europe, and how somehow it then connected to all these different other ideas. And there is a lot of discussion within degrowth over the years of how does it really make sense. There have been lots and lots of conversations on whether a word which is so negative, which is like does that really, exactly what you were talking about, does that really provide some, is it only countering against something, or does it actually provide some visions or some alternatives? And here I think the degrowth vocabulary, which Xander mentioned before, is a very good starting point, because it has all these tiny chapters of 3 pages long and talks about all these different ways in which you can think of the alternatives, you can think of the different visions which degrowth offers. And connecting a little bit with this idea of utopia, I think there is a very beautiful quote that we talk about quite a bit. I will not be able to say it word by word, but it basically says that utopia is a pathway. It's like you will never be able to reach it. It's just the journey, and the moment you go there, the moment you think you're reaching towards it, something else will change, and you will keep on making this journey of thinking of what is the meaning of good life, what is the meaning of prosperity, how can we relate to each other in a careful, in a considerate way, how can we think of socio-ecological justice and equity. So I think that is more or less this idea of where degrowth comes from, and I think it's also important to this idea that you said that it's an amoeba term. No, it can mean anything and nothing at the same time. I think that's also the beauty of using this term, because when I think of degrowth in my context, it's completely different from when you think of degrowth in your context. And if the bottom line of degrowth is to repoliticize the debate on socio-ecological justice and equity, it will mean different things in different contexts. And I think that's why the fact that globally we are all fighting against a system which is unjust, which is creating so many multidimensional inequalities, then in different contexts, how to fight that and how to make sure that all the different fights are kind of connected is this idea of degrowth. I think I'll stop there.
Anyone else wants to chime in? Or do we go to the questions in the chat, which I'm very happy that there are quite a lot of them. So first of all, there's Maya asking, there's some that are kind of related to each other, but Maya was asking about if I can find it now. Wait. Yeah, so what do you see as the solution for social benefits and kind of social policy, since their funding is based currently on economic growth? Is the solution economic growth with less resource intensive production services? If not, if we refuse the idea of growth altogether, is economic depression inevitable, and how to deal with that? Can basic income work in zero growth, degrowth societies? And I think that also more in an academic setting, Eva also asked about what are the next steps in renewing academic paradigms, including funding to address the knowledge production. Well, not completely related to, but related to funding, both of these in a way. So academic paradigms, including funding to address knowledge production systems concerning the grand challenges that have been solved today. How would you reply to these two?
I could give it a go. I think that indeed there is a huge contradiction, that in Degrowth we advocate for all these social redistribution policies, that are based on economic growth, but they're necessary at the moment because you need to redistribute. You need to redistribute what has, to reverse what's been happening for many decades. You need to, redistribute locally, like nationally, to account for all this internal colonization. You need to distribute globally, account for all the ecological debt. So all this is necessary, to get to a level where then, when we get there, it's a bit. Going back to the question of Prototti, when we get there and suddenly we don't need to redistribute anymore, and there's no economic growth and there's not surplus value, and then we just work out something different, I think. But at the moment we need to overcome, that inequality. So I think these policies will be needed for a long time yet. And I don't know what you think about this. I mean, I'm here defending degrowth as if I was the biggest advocate of degrowth, and I actually see it, I don't feel I'm defending a lot, but I mean, yeah, there's a lot of inconsistencies in degrowth, and it's not an old solution for everything. It's just, it provides solutions that we're going to need some are utopian at the end, and some are solutions very, very close, like stop advertising, provide basic income. So these solutions are going to lead to the next step, but at the end, it doesn't provide. For me, the biggest one that I like about degrowth is democracy, is the fact that we're going to have a lot of direct democracy, and that is what's going to drive what's going to happen after. Actually, we are going to be able to design that, hopefully, that's my hope. And that's why for me, the democratic one is the most important, because many of the things that will happen after, we just don't know. And so hence the importance of decolonizing the imaginary. What I was saying, about what's happening in Chile is, okay, we give power to the people, but then what's the people going to do with that power? Go on, Katerina.
Yeah, thanks, Marta. It's actually really nice that you mentioned that at the end. My connection is unstable again, sorry. About democracy, because I was going to say something similar about, and going back to Sana's question as well, about sort of what is at the end of growthism. I think we can't answer that in particular detail, because it shouldn't really be designed by technical experts or whatever, but collectively decided. And the drawback of that is that when you have processes where you make these decisions collectively, they don't happen in a vacuum. In Chile, where the progressive constitution was rejected, and that process happened in a media landscape that was media and right-wing, that happened in the context of racism, in the context of kind of patriarchal, still remain against the plurinational and sort of radical proposals that were contained in this new constitution. And now, as Marta said, we have this other kind of capture by right-wing forces, I guess, of this new constitutional process. So which is why changing to decolonize, which is why that is in this sort of cultural sense, but also our own communications, our goals, and against these connect our struggles for degrowth, or for sort of decreasing productions, with anti-racist struggles, with indigenous struggles, etc. But I think the other thing, going back to Maya's question, I think very briefly on how to sort of fund these policies that are currently depending on growth, I guess sort of the proposal that is being made within Degrowth a lot is to step out of this growth paradigm, is to basically stop taxing what people, that provides the base of living for people. So stop taxing people's income, for example, and instead tax pollution, and instead tax environmental bads. And you can do this in combination with a cap, for example, that you have sort of declining resource use over time, because we just have taxes that doesn't necessarily put a limit on amount of pollution that's. So that's the sort of if we can have a climate income, and use that income from pollution to give or afford a universal basic income for everyone. And I guess then whether GDP goes up or down, that's the crucial question. And as well, going back to Sana, what's at the end of the path? As long as we, as long as we create is based on democracy, that is based, equality of being, and sort of equality, it won't matter whether it goes up or down, or most likely, because it is attached to material processes, it will be going down. So those are my 5 cents. Thank you.
Thank you. Then we had from Sabaheta question, which I think relates very much to the democracy and decolonial considerations related to degrowth. She says, regarding the point that we can approach degrowth as an organizing or a sister concept or movement, I wonder, how do you see this position sitting with the position that there's a need to ensure the pluriverse of the different movements and solidarity between them? I think the two positions are not coexisting well together if we consider the competition for political resource and popular support, but also if we consider the extractivism of ideas. For example, feminist scholars constantly and rightfully argue that their points and ideas are either ignored, misunderstood, or romanticized, or appropriated in emerging concepts and debates, including degrowth. And this relates to also Sapaheta's question later on in the chat, where she asks about the use of the word we and our land and our debate and we as people, and how can we kind of use that, or what are the problematics with using that kind of language? Who gets to decide who is the we, and who can rightfully claim this leading role in fixing the world? Yeah, if you want to address that.
Rototi, you want to?
I can say something. So this idea that, I mean, I totally agree with the first question of how, and this is a structural problem of academia, no? And this is something which I think we've also been touching upon a little bit: extractive knowledge, extractive education, extractive research. And I think one of the, I mean, there have been steps which people in the degrowth movement, which is also a very weird term, no? Who are the people of the degrowth movement? Are they the people sitting and writing papers? Are they the people in first line of defense fighting against airports, or the different movements that Xander was mentioning? Or are they people who are living in eco villages? So who are the proponents of degrowth? But there have been ways of trying to build solidarities and alliances with different voices, so that, for like the example that I wanted to give is the Feminist and Degrowth Alliance, which was started a few years ago in one of the degrowth conferences. And the idea is precisely for not to have these kind of issues of taking over voices or romanticizing, or not providing a space for be it indigenous scholars, be it feminist activists, to have their say, and not to talk over them, or not to take the voice and take the knowledge and do something, and profit from something and not give anything back. So I think in that sense, this is definitely still a process which needs much more work. But it is quite clear that degrowth, if any kind of degrowth world needs to emerge, I don't even know what that means. It has to be feminist and it has to be decolonial. How to do it is something that I think all of us need to think together and go forward. This was one question. And the other question, Martha, do you want to talk about that? Who are the we? Who are we talking on behalf of?
I think you addressed it in a way, no? That, Xander.
Yeah, no, I think just to kind of comment on the first part, I mean, there's so much to say about what extractive research and what it is. And a lot of it has to do that people are going there. And I mean, part of it's also a lack of understanding and knowledge of what academia even is when people are in those areas. But I think the big problem is that people are struggling and fighting. Well, people come in, don't really know much about the struggles, and then go back and then make a salary writing about those struggles. And then there's a qualitative conversation about what that really means and what's actually there. And then there's the issue that people don't even really understand what's going on in those struggles half the time. People don't even know the difference between different anarchisms and Marxisms, which relates to the question of, we talk about feminism, but there's so much anarcho-feminist stuff that completely gets ignored that's not talked about in this. There's so much, literally anything that's critical, insurrectionary, anarchist, decolonial, if it's actually challenging these things, and it's not like, it is often erased from these things if it's normal. But maybe to move into the next part, I mean, I think the we and I and our land or whatever, I think this is really important, and it's really how we actually, I can't agree with this enough, because it really is a question of how we're actually identifying with status or colonial institutions. where do we stand? Like, do we, in terms of, from the lens of an ecocidal perspective, whether it's dictatorship or democracy, extractivism continues. You know, obviously there's a lot of nuance in how this happens, but one of the strengths as a social control mechanism that democracy has, or at least representative democracy, is that you think you participate in it. It's a part of you. You self-identify it. You think it's yours, despite the legacy of genocide and ecocide behind it. And it's continuation. It's not over. You know, it's just evolved. It's more technologically advanced. You don't see it. There's more enchantments. So I think it's really important for us to identify, and I said this already before, you know, what is the relationship between state formation, colonialism, and the evolution of the state in different respective areas and its objectives and modus operandi. But also, what does that mean for how we identify with our institution? How do we identify with our institutions? Are they an imposition on our life? Is it a continuation of colonial war? Or is it an exercise of democracy and how it works? Ultimately, how you identify these things is going to determine your disposition and how you're analyzing conflict, which I think is rather important. But yeah, I think Sabeta, great comment, and I hope people really look at what's happening to themselves, and not only themselves and how we're put in boxes and surrounded by toxic waste, but also look at the trees, look at how everything's manicured outside and everything's controlled. You know, it's very clear what type of society we live in, we just don't see it.
That was really beautiful, Xander. Thanks so much. And I think I was what that made me think of in terms of a previous question as well about sort of the you know, degrowth just being in opposition is something negative. I mean, everyone here might, you know, is probably aware of the tons and tons of debates around whether or not we should call ourselves post-growth or non-growth or a-growth, or, you know, how, you know, much degrowth puts a lot to the fact that, unlike others, the well-being, for example, difficult as a term because corporations really have no interest in degrowing. And so I think that can put the movement into a fairly strong position in terms of what we advocate for. But it's just, you know, how do we get that message across, and how do we, you know, make that disassociation between good things and endless growth?
Thank you. Excellent contributions. I'm going to shoot a few questions here from the chat to all of you. So Maria is asking, what message will you give to local people who believe in modernity? For example, in southwestern Spain, changing lands to solar panel lands, mining to contribute with Green Deal, or building new water demanding berry farms around Doñana National Park using the lack of water. Then there are a good couple of shout outs to different publications. And then we had a question from Joe, a comment related to agreeing with learning from the indigenous communities, having recently worked on indigenous business development. In Australia, there's a lot to learn in terms of perceptions of what good economy looks like, for example. Again, not quite the continuous growth rhetoric that perpetuates. And then Arildo asks about maybe talking more about the ecosystem services and social metabolism, and how ecology and conservation could integrate those perspectives of social metabolism and degrowth into their analysis and research. Then there was a question and a mention of the Beyond Growth conference next week happening at the European Parliament, and Jane is talking about how the IPCC report mentions degrowth, but then there's a lot of contradictory policies and narratives that the speakers also point out. So do you or any of you see these ideas being picked up meaningfully at policy level? So a couple of questions now to all of you.
I could try and take a couple. I didn't get all of them. There's one on Spain, and what I would say to people that, you know, in a drought, this as in Spain now turning to solar panel lands, and I cannot tell people anything. I don't know. I don't feel like I can tell people anything. I mean, if I see a difference between water demanding berry farms around the Doñana National Park, which are obviously going to extract resources that are sustaining ecosystems that obviously these berry farmers don't value, which are the Doñana and all the animals that depend on that. So I would say something to them. In a drought-stricken dehesas, I mean, I don't know the context, but if you have drought and you want, and I don't know, is there a conflict there? I just don't know. But if local people do want that, we do need some solar farms. We don't need land for that. So it's about resource sovereignty. So if you want to use the land for energy and material extraction, yes, please. Please do it in a way that impacts the land as less as possible. Don't do massive farms that is going to impact the land massively. I don't know. Is everybody in agreement there? It's I can't give really, you know, I don't know the case, but by all means, if here in Australia, this Naju Aboriginal Corporation, they came to look for help from the University of Queensland to actually defend themselves from huge there's new projects coming on their lands. They already have mining. They live next to mine. They hear mining every day and night. And there's a lot more mining coming to them, huge winds and solar farms coming to them into their lands. They have no right to say no. And they come into University of Queensland to ask for help to actually put, in science terms, value into their lands. Because obviously the indigenous language of I have connections to the land, it's not valued. This connects a bit to the other, the other questions about, this person that has been looking into business corporations and through indigenous groups. There's a huge, here in Australia, there's a huge debate who many indigenous groups want to, make profit out of this. And whilst other people, there's all these internal conflicts. Some people want to make business out of this. Some others who are perhaps more connected to the land because they haven't moved from there, maybe don't want those projects. This lady explained to us this beautiful cosmovision of dreaming, they call it. All Australia, all their land is connected through paths, invisible paths of dreaming. And even though they don't extract the land, they don't use the land for their livelihoods, they have this deep connection to it and they want to protect it. So you in this economy that we live at the moment, that you don't give value to these things, then people, they speak this, they was telling us, they speak about this to the state and to the companies, and the people were just like, understand that companies, like, it travels through them. It's like they don't listen to them because it doesn't provide economic value. Anyway, I don't know if this is as the people, and there's a conflict there. I will support the local people there.
Sander.
Maybe I can say something about the Brussels conference next week. So there is a fear that we don't know what's going to happen. It's a huge conference. There are 2,000 registered people and 2,000 more who are supposed to be online. And the hope is that, so there are like multiple focus group discussions and panels on like different topics, thinking on what is a just transition, how can you think on a EU level, and then also more broadly on things like cities, urban spaces, transport, food, energy, everything, on how to go well, they call it beyond growth, but that's the idea, how to get away from growth and look at other ways of measuring prosperity. But at the same time, you also don't know if the message is going to get a little bit diluted, because it's such a big, like, there are so many different people with so many different visions of what is this beyond growth and what is this prosperity idea looking like. So I think a lot of us are excited and nervous to go there and engage with politicians and policymakers.
So, actually, Katrina, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, thanks. Let me come back. I don't know if any reductions already sort of years that are being arena. I'll stop my video again. Yeah, so recently in the UK, for example, we've had a big trial with a lot of private companies and also local councils, so sort of local government, public bodies who have reduced their working time, worked 4 days whilst, and the was that the productivity session of modernity wasn't allowed to and actually a lot of those companies and also council, I think Cambridgeshire Council, County Council, were actually decided to keep that model because they found that either productivity had gone up or their retention rates had increased. And I think that's a really sort of very easy, simple, you know, forward to, and that market to reduce working environmental pressure to, you know, make your life and escape that kind of commitment some form or another. Of course, you know, we don't know whether these workers then just fly to Mallorca anyway, for example, for a weekend. But I think that's a very big one, and I think that is gaining traction, sort of independent of, you know, what degrowthers think about it potentially. So interesting to see.
Yeah, is that it? Okay. I'm not really sure if any of those questions were geared towards me, but I'm gonna respond to something that I kind of heard, or maybe a general point. I think something that kind of was a marked. It's something we've actually been discussing a little bit. But I just really want to stress themselves. I really feel like researchers still talk about it like they're from this disembodied perspective, looking at kind of social engineering things, or we are genuinely really disconnected because we are working in universities and really thinking like how to manage society and look at it this way, or how to do this, or how to make a public policy to make things better. And I just want to stress to everyone, and it's also a reminder to myself, because I'm in this meat grinder as well, you know, but that we're in this. We have a stake in all of these conflicts. We are in these conflicts. Activism, everyone is an activist. Some people are statist or fascist economists. Some people are agroecologists. Everyone is performing a type of activism. Things and people either being labeled or self-labeled activists is this way to actually call people to say that they're not objective and that they don't mean as much, or to try to isolate them that way within an institution. The benefit of this is you can make some kind of weird scholar activist niche that hopefully Pluto or AK Press or one of these kind of so-called independent or Verso, these so-called kind of radical publishers or independent publishers, you know, maybe it can help you with like a certain demographic with their marketing so you can sell more books or something like this. And maybe there's a self-identification aspect that can make you feel good or wake up in the morning a little bit better. But I would say to you, everyone's doing a type of activism. Researchers have to stop putting themselves outside these conflicts. Whether where you live, in the city you are, the institution you work in, or if you're doing the misnamed field work, or if you're doing local research, you're a part of this. You're not, I mean, everyone's a do no harm, you know, the anthropological ethics. And you can try to minimize harm in some way, but you're still there. You're still in the ecosystem. Everything in a conflict-afflicted, you know, doing research in conflict-affected areas, you are in this. A big dollar signs walking into that area. And it's no, people are aware of this. So people have to know who they are. People have to know what their politics are. People have to know what they're trying to make and where they stand and what type of activity, what type of life they want to live and be embodied in that. And so this is just a way to say that we're not objective. And I mean, come on, post-structuralism, feminism, you know, has done really, really, really well at showing this. And this is the fact, and anthropology has integrated this, even though somehow it's as colonial as it's ever been. And I don't know how with all of its self-reflexivity, but still in other segments of the university, there's still this game of pretending to be, and obviously you can try to be more objective, but come on, the ideology is running this game and academia and how this research is done and the research funding and what's okay and not, or even how this conversation's happening. It's completely like this, but it's just to say, we're in these conflicts. So let's really think about what we want to make in our lives, either locally or in our own research. And I think this is important. And yeah, all right, that's enough for me.
Thank you. Very good point. It's not trivial intellectual exercises we're doing here. I'm gonna pick up a question from I'm probably going to just miss some of your comments. I apologize for that. We are tight on time here, but I'm gonna pick up one more question that hasn't really related to an issue that hasn't really been yet discussed. This is from Usman. A lot of policies proposed as degrowth need to engage with the role of state. How do you see state in this debate? Antagonistic, possibility of transformation, evolutionary, and this is commented further by Leslie, saying that it is too late to rely on state or corporations to act. They have had plenty of time and plenty of evidence. The key issue now is preparing for the challenges to come. So, role of state, how do you see that?
I actually wanted to go back to the previous one. And then I'll tackle this one. I mean, don't think we're all activists in academia. We should be activists. I mean, because for me, activism is not like you politicize. One thing is that you have a political entity, you want to play it or not. Your research is never neutral. I do understand that. There's always power relations in what you do. There's always influence of your institution. There's nothing such as objectivity. I do get that. But at the same time, activism for me is when you're actively, I mean, I haven't done research on this, no, but this is my gut feeling, okay? That when you're actively doing something for what you think is good, no, what you think is the right thing to do. And so when a scholar says he's activist, I actually think that he's not only a scholar writing academic papers, but he's also active in the movements themselves, in the movement we've been talking about. And I think that that's the value of it, that you and I agree with you. We should all be activists, but activists, mindfully activists. So our research is not out there, hanging there, but it's actually connected. No, there's this comment by Katarina about this Gramscian idea that I wasn't aware, but the fact that you need to unite them, the intellectuals with the movements. And I think it's very important when we do this, but we have to do this through our research. Yeah. And about the role of the state, probably others are able to respond this better than me. I think, I don't know, I haven't explored much about it, but I think that at the moment, we need to act at both levels. The strategy is to act at both levels and see where this gets at. But what do you think?
Can I go back to the last point on activism in academia? I think here I would agree a little bit more with what Xander was saying, because it's often people who then say that they are scholar activist, are then questioned to be not objective. But if you look at the entire structure, the people who are doing whatever modeling or who are analyzing the data and trying to find solutions are also doing it from their biases. And they never get questioned for being not objective because somehow they are neutral because they're looking at numbers. But I think there have been a lot of research done from feminist decolonial scholarship which says, no, they are just as biased. It's just when you are talking with the people or when you are trying to question the system that you are considered an activist and you are not objective enough. And I've had in papers having these comments like, you're not neutral, you're not scientific. And then I have had to find papers which says why it's important to not be scientific and to not being neutral, because this is the idea that they play with, that the moment you say that you're working with the community, the moment you say that you're concerned about the climate crisis and hence what you're saying comes from that, you are not objective and you're not authentic enough. And I think this is something that we need to question and challenge more in the academic institutions. Yeah.
Anyone want to continue or tackle the last question?
I can say this. I guess I'll get into it quickly, but no, thank you so much. Baroti, I think you understood what I was saying, and that there's a lot of activisms going on in the university, and I think we shouldn't call what we do. We should definitely aim, I think, in the direction. I mean, a lot of people are doing what they think is good and the right thing with green growth, eco-modernism, and crunching numbers and assimilating in society in a certain way, So it's really, how can we actually just make normal, making better quality relationships, better qualities of water, happier trees, happier edible landscapes and things like this, that I think what we're aiming for is what everyone wants. But moving on to the question of the state really quick, I think it's so significant. Maybe I'm being a bit silly, but I think having the astute Leslie Sclair here, the theorist of the transnational capitalist class, I think it is amazing on the issue of the state raised by Usman in this thing, that their reply to this, because I often see Gramscian scholars talking about the historic bloc and doing things like this. And I'm actually very pleased to see this response, to see that it is too late to rely on the state or corporations to act. They have had plenty of time and plenty of evidence. The key is now preparing for the challenges to come. I couldn't agree more. And it's really nice to see this from a Gramscian scholar. And such an astute one at that. But my general line on the state, I see it as a huge obstruction. It is the framework by which extractivism, financial plundering, and everything operates. It is the platform to even make these kind of delusional divisions between the private and public sector, even if there's something there still. So the state is a serious obstruction and problem. All the people who have actually tried to seize the means of production of the state, from Lenin to the pink tide countries, let's really look what happened there. Let's remember the conversations between Marx and Bakunin. Let's remember Bakunin's warnings. And even Noam Chomsky himself says one of the few social science predictions that were ever so correct was Bakunin in predicting what Marxism would lead into, i.e. Leninism and Stalinism. And this was to really understand that the logic of bureaucracy, the logic of what I'd say the colony, and how this changes people and what it does. And power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, if we want to be kind of cheesy with it, but also I think there's something to it. But I think maybe more to Sclair's comment right now, and my own personal position is that we really have to do everything we can. And the state is a problem, it's there. And so really how to widen spaces of freedom, how to widen spaces of unmediated action, how to deal with zoning laws that are going to support, edible landscapes, and actually, how are we going to actually make it so they're not protesting as everything's called terrorism right now. The state literally calls anything terrorism that challenges economic or state interests. So really, there needs to be interventions everywhere for there's total war being waged against people, and there needs to be a permanent ecological conflict against this war. And I think people need to use everything that we can to work together with a common vision of, more decentralized, more just really working to rehabilitate our social relationships, our capacities to act, our capacities to grow food, our capacities to defend. And this is not easy, and it's something that just people have to get going. And this is something that maybe happens outside our official workplaces. But yeah, again.
Thank you. And I'm afraid that we're kind of used up our allotted time here. I thank you all so much for your conversations, and I'd still offer all of you 10 seconds, 20 seconds final comment, wrap up what you took out of this or want to still share for everyone. Let's start with Marta.
I don't know. I think, I don't know, I'm going to go into the question of the we, who is the we in, I think that we use the we too easily, and we need to be more aware of who are we erasing, as academics, as degrowth activists, to make sure we make more clear what are we trying to obtain, and what are we, I don't know. I mean, sometimes I feel that, when exposed to these questions, sometimes I feel, who is me, that is advocating for the growth and all these changes. And I guess we are activists that we just trying to do. I try to do what I can locally, in order to, for example, here where I am at the moment, I try to build the local climate change movement. It's the only movement that will work where I live. And I try to work locally with groups here. So I need to work locally. I think we all need to work locally. And I think it's important that I show what I do to make it political, not to challenge the system. So I think it's about acting locally, but at the same time, showing it, screaming it to the world that that's what you're doing. It's not good enough to say, to catch a train instead of the plane, but you have to actually show it. You have to make it political, all your everyday actions. And I think, this is a way of making activism count. And I think this is something I need to do in my everyday life. See, it's very difficult to say I all the time. I say we all the time. Anyway, and and I really think that the challenge of extractivism, what I've learned through this talk and preparing this talk is massive, because it's so ingrained in the system that we have. It's so ingrained to capitalism, and capitalism's been ingrained for so long. That is a huge task, but that that I'm always I'm hopeful. I'm always hopeful. I don't see the empty glass. Thank you.
I think for me also, this discussion was very, very interesting, and you got like lots of different perspectives. And at the same time also, I think I felt there are certain areas in which we really need to work hard on, from a degrowth and linking it with extractivism's perspectives, questions on like how knowledges are being appropriated within the movement or within degrowth academia. And one thing which I always feel at the end of these kind of more academic settings is, really, it has to be much, much more than writing papers and articles and going out and doing actual action. So I will stop with that.
Who's up next?
Can you hear me? Is it my connection? Okay. I mean, I enjoyed this conversation. It's like it points to the challenges ahead, and you know, the sort of and what Xander was saying as well, sort of how ingrained this commitment to growth, to productivism is in our lives, and how this anthropocentrism and sort of our dedication to, you know, or disconnect from nature is almost as much as a barrier than, you know, capitalism itself, and sort of, you know, that it has feedback loops and feeds off each other. And I think paying attention to these cultural politics of socio-ecological transformation is going to be also really important, in addition to, you know, strengthening our links with local communities. And, you know, when in terms of research, in terms of decolonizing research, you know, the important bit is to be led by those with and for whom we research, right? So, you know, that means, you know, we don't have to fly across the world. We can do online workshops now if the internet's good enough. And you know, research objectives can be defined by those, you know, with whom we research. And so to if you are in London and speaking about sort of, you know, challenging these power structures from the middle, sort of in between the state and the private sector as a sort of collective social movement, really a fantastic group of people who's come together in London, who call themselves Degrowth London, and this is sort of home for degrowthers in London. So if you are in the UK, I've just put their website in the chat. They've only really just constituted or put themselves together. They have their launch event in later this month, and it's actually sold out. I mean, I say launch event, they call it a degrowth party, which is much more interesting. So, you know, if you did want to get in touch with them or find out more, please do. Yeah, and I'll leave it here. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And Xander, please be very concise.
No, don't worry, don't worry. I have nothing to say. I have nothing but gratitude and appreciation for Marta and our lovely discussants and everyone who showed up today. Thank you for being here for this conversation. And of course, I love EXALT. EXALT is such a great platform. And if people have ideas and want to organize panels to kind of bring up more critical ideas related to extractivism, I think that they should write us.
Yeah, absolutely. Hear, hear. Write to us if you have a great idea for a next dialogue. I want to thank you, all of the speakers. Sorry?
I think probably for next year.
Maybe for next year, yeah. But thank you so much, all the participants, all of you speakers. Thanks, Xander, for organizing this with me. This was a super lovely conversation. And though technology has all of its problems, I'm happy that we got to connect like this across distances. And yeah, very anticlimactically just saying thank you and bye.